the moderator first raised it, Taiwan. It's an absolute joke. I mean, I went to Taiwan for the first time in 1993. This is something I do know something about. I've been back to Taiwan once a year for the last 20 years. Okay, I lecture at Taiwan University, okay? Now, in 1993, when I first went to Taiwan, I loved the place. It was so beautiful, so gentle, so Chinese. You know, in mainland China, where I came from, we destroyed so much of our own culture because of the stupid revolutions. I love the place. The last 10 years, the place has been a disaster since they started electing their presidents. Disaster, okay? Taipei has not changed for 10 years. Infrastructure is in terrible disrepair. Total underinvestment in health and education, okay? Everything, the middle income has been dropping for 10 years straight. Middle class people have nothing to look forward to. Let me give you one number to show. Taiwan has 23 million people, total population. A full 1.3 million are now living and working on the mainland. 1.3 million, okay, what's the number? That's 7-8% of the population. If you take away the old people and the young people, 15% of adults of Taiwan are living and working on the mainland. Now, all those people, almost all of them, are highly educated people with college degrees. So if you take away the taxi drivers, the dishwashers, and the maids, half of the educated elites have moved to the mainland. If you take away those who moved to North America and Europe, the educated elites are left on the island are either politicians or Mingzui guys like us, talking on television. Okay? There's no one else left. No wonder the entire high-tech miracle is over in Taiwan. Have you heard of, I mean, when I was growing up, when I was going into business, Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, those were the dream companies. All gone. Never heard of another Taiwanese company anymore, and you're not going to hear another one for the next 20 years, I guarantee you, under this political system. It ain't going to happen. Okay, so I rest my case.
In China, we have a regime that exists on campuses called the 7 No's, 7 不, 7 things you're not supposed to talk about. And I'm sorry to say, Dr. Fuller, that almost everything you've spoken about would be encompassed by those 7 不. I'm not even sure that the founding fathers would get much of a hearing.
That's not enforced rigorous. I teach democratic theory. I just did it last night at Tsinghua University. I mean, yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, Dr. Lee, Eric, is one of the most articulate and certainly sophisticated defenders of the political system as it exists in China. You're quoted as saying in an article you wrote for Foreign Affairs magazine, which I just read, you talked about a post-democratic future. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, thank you. I'm not a defender of anything, and I'm not an advocate of anything. I'm just a student of political systems. So I like to analyze things instead of sort of advocate something or defend something. But I think it's useful, let me suggest that we first define what we're talking about. So I think we should have a definition of democracy that we could work off of. And let me suggest something for consideration. I think democracy in today's world, at least, means universal suffrage, one person, one vote, plus periodical multi-party elections. Party compete to get into power, plus possibly referendums. That's a fair description of democracy, how democracy is defined today. If you don't have these things, I think people won't call you a democracy. Okay? So let me say that I think that model of governance is in deep trouble, and its future is dismal. It's in the worst crisis in probably 100 years. And I think it's useful first to take a historical perspective. Democracy as we know it, as we just defined it, I think takes its lineage from representative institutions that began in England 400 or 500 years ago, or 200-300 years ago, depending on how you interpret history. Yeah? And it evolved to today. So if you accept that, I think most political scientists would accept that, then democracy as we know it is an accident. That model of governance we just described, universal suffrage, multi-party elections, referendums, is an accident. Because those who pioneered and built representative institutions, including the founding fathers of the United States, those who designed it, were extraordinarily hostile to political power of the people. They would have hated universal suffrage. In fact, they opposed it with everything they got, number one. And they hated the idea of political parties. That was a fact. In America, in France and Germany, outlawed political parties until recently, like 100 years ago or something. And of course, I think it was Madison finally reluctantly formed a political party. He hated the idea, he had to do it. Okay, so they hated universal suffrage, and they hated political parties. And referendum, my God, they turn over in their graves. So I think democracy is I'm not making any judgment on it. I'm just saying, factually, it's an accident of historical development. It was not intended that way, number one. Number two, democracy as we know it is a contradiction. Okay, and that contradiction, of course, every American high school student is taught that contradiction. Democracy, of course, took its roots in the liberal outlook, liberté, égalité, fraternité, or life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal. Now, these concepts are inherently contradictory to each other. For instance, the most basic one, of course, is liberty and equality. They are fundamentally a contradiction. We talked about rule of law, for instance. Everyone is treated equal before the law. Of course, that's about liberty. You're free. But are you free is it fair or is it equal if I have more money, I hire a better lawyer, and you're poor, you don't have access to a better lawyer, and I win the case? How do you resolve that conflict? Or do you want to level the playing field and have a welfare state? Nobody could hire their own private lawyer, Obamacare for the law. Okay, just a couple of examples. Okay, freedom of speech, liberty. I can say anything I want. But does that mean that if I have money, I can buy all the advertising on television, all the commercials on television to support one policy or one candidate? The Supreme Court of the United States just said you could. For decades, they said you could not. But last week, they just said, yes, you could. And of course, a lot of people in America think it's a horrible idea. It's completely against the idea of equality. But then, of course, the concept of liberty will say that it's my money, why can't I spend it this way I see fit to express my speech? So these concepts are fundamentally opposed to each other, and these are irreconcilable differences, irreconcilable. And so is it possible? Is it possible? Don't hold me to it. Is it possible? The success of the West, of the modern West in the last 200 years, was achieved not because of democracy, but despite of it. Just, is it possible that we're at a point where these conflicts are truly irreconcilable? Before, for a long time, those conflicts might have been paid or covered up or being able to, the system grew out of it because of, for instance, in the case of Great Britain, of course, colonization, externalized a lot of the conflicts. Prisoners too nasty, send them to Australia, right? Import resources, or is it possible? So is that possible that we're at a point, if you go to America, they can't resolve the question of the role of government? It's an irreconcilable conflict. You can argue and kill each other, and you still won't agree on it, the role of government. And they will be debating that for the next 30 years, I guaranteed. Okay, so democracy is a contradiction. Third, democracy as we know it has become highly dysfunctional. If you examine all the entire developed world, from America to Europe, highly dysfunctional, partisan, they can't agree on anything. It turns out, it's very, very funny, when I was going to school, the political scientists of my time were telling me one of the great attributes of democracy is it's flexible, self-correction, FDR, self-corrected, save capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But it turns out today's democracy is highly rigid. It cannot change. What's his name? Fareed Zakaria, the political scientist in America, said last year at some point when he was frustrated, maybe he didn't mean it, but he said, America really should adopt a parliamentary system. This presidential system sucked. It couldn't work. We need a parliamentary system. But is that possible? Of course, it's not possible. Every political scientist worth his stripes will tell you that today it's virtually impossible to amend the US Constitution. Not possible. Impossible barriers to cross. So even within different types of democratic models, you cannot move from one to the other. You can't make Britain a presidential system. Not possible. So or vice versa. So even within different types of democratic models, it's so rigid as to not be able to make that change. Okay? It's an imperfect comparison, I take it, but I was talking about the 18th Party Congress in China, right? The highest ruling body, the standing committee of the Communist Party Politburo, used to have 9 members. For 10 years, they had 9 members. It turned out to be a bad idea. Everybody knew, inefficient, powers diffused. And then at the 18th Party Congress, they took it down to 7. Like that. Can you imagine taking the US Senate from 100 to 88? Is that possible? Not possible. Even if you need to do it, not possible. Okay, and then we're in a situation where the political scientist Dr. Olson, in his great book called Rise and Fall of Nations, incredible book, talked about the concept of distributive coalitions. So democracy is advanced to a certain degree where distributive coalitions are choking it to death. They can't agree on anything, they're just looking after themselves. Frank Fukuyama called it vetocracy. So not democracy, but vetocracy. So nothing can get done, okay? So you have all these issues. Last week, Princeton University, two really good professors. I just read the whole thing from beginning to the end. It's actually a book. I read it on the plane this morning. I got up too early and enough coffee. Professor Gillens and Professor Page from Princeton University. It's incredible. It's called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. It's a really, really good study. At first, I thought this was some liberal crap, okay? And I read it. I was so surprised by how scholarly it was conducted. They researched, this is, I think, the first work of this kind. They researched American public policy since 1971, or 1971 to 2000 something. And they did a full range study. And they segregated the American public from income level 90th percentile, 95th percentile, and 5th percentile. And turned out, based on public opinion surveys, the 90th percentile or above held totally opposite views of public policies as opposed to the 50th percentile. And almost 99% of the public policies that got enacted in those 30 or 40 years, guess who won? The 95th percentile. So this study, actually, in their summary, basically says America is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. It is, in fact, an oligarchy, that the views of the average citizens are in fact irrelevant for decade after decade. And it's a really good study. You should really study. This is the first time I've seen a lot of data. Okay, so it's in trouble in the developed world. Okay, and I think democracy is in even deeper trouble in the developing world. After the Cold War, Freedom House had this number. I read it all the time. The number of countries that adopted electoral democracy, the one we defined, had skyrocketed. From 47 to like 140 or something. Everybody bought it. Okay, and let's take a survey of these 100 or so countries. Okay, from Middle East to Africa to Southeast Asia, everybody's still corrupt as hell. Those who are fighting civil wars are fighting worse civil wars. Those who are poor got poorer. Now, there are a couple of examples, a couple of exceptions. Okay, a heck of a lot more failure stories than success stories. A few cases that being billed as success stories. Korea is one. And I don't know enough about Korea, so I don't want to comment on it. I think you got a lot of challenges too. But the other was, I think it was an absolute joke. The moderator first raised it. Taiwan. It's an absolute joke. I went to Taiwan for the first time in 1993. This is something I do know something about. I've been back to Taiwan once a year for the last 20 years. Okay, I lecture at Taiwan University, okay? Now, in 1993, when I first went to Taiwan, I loved the place. It was so beautiful, so gentle, so Chinese. In mainland China, where I came from, we destroyed so much of our own culture because of the stupid revolutions. I love the place. The last 10 years, the place has been a disaster since they started electing their presidents. Disaster, okay? Taipei has not changed for 10 years. Infrastructure is in terrible disrepair. Total underinvestment in health and education, okay? Everything, the middle income has been dropping for 10 years straight. Middle class people have nothing to look forward to. Let me give you one number to show. Taiwan has 23 million people, total population. A full 1.3 million are now living and working on the mainland. 1.3 million, okay, what's the number? That's 7-8% of the population. If you take away the old people and the young people, 15% of adults of Taiwan are living and working on the mainland. Now, all those people, almost all of them, are highly educated people with college degrees. So if you take away the taxi drivers, the dishwashers, and the maids, half of the educated elites have moved to the mainland. If you take away those who moved to North America and Europe, the educated elites are left on the island are either politicians or Minzui guys like us, talking on television. Okay? There's no one else left. No wonder the entire high-tech miracle is over in Taiwan. Have you heard of, when I was growing up, when I was going into business, Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, those were the dream companies. All gone. Never heard of another Taiwanese company anymore, and you're not going to hear another one for the next 20 years, I guarantee you, under this political system. It ain't going to happen. Okay, so I rest my case.
That's such a demolition job on Taiwan. I almost feel like I should leap to its defense, but I hope there's some Taiwanese in the audience who'll do that for me. By the way, one can breathe the air over there, which is something to be said. Let me, where do we go from here? Professor Bell Daniel, you were going to correct me on the Chibu, the 7 no's, and describe democracy as it is practiced on campuses in China.
Oh, well, that these, orders, if that's what we want to call them, when they filter down to the university, they tend not to be enforced in any serious way. I've been teaching in China for 10 years, and I teach political theory, including very sensitive material. Just last night, I gave a seminar on, well, it wasn't a seminar, it's addressing undergraduates on John Stuart Mill's idea of representative government. The only constraint I've ever faced in 10 years teaching in China was I was told not to teach Marxism because my interpretation might differ from the official interpretation. Other than that, of course, when it comes to publication, in English they don't care. In Chinese, then there is censorship. But again, if you put it on the internet, as you probably know, every publisher has a kind of party guy who has to sign off and take responsibility. And often some of them are more cautious than others, so you can move from one publisher to another. But on the internet, it's much more free. There's hardly anybody there enforcing it, at least compared to the public. What's published in hard copy, so to speak. So I just mean that I know it's not it's not something that is taken seriously even by those of us who teach in very sensitive areas.
And yet, if one takes just one of the components of a democracy, as it was laid out for us, transparency. You have examples now in China of people who are being put in jail for advocating a very moderate form of transparency. Xu Zhiyong, and what did he want? He wanted basically government officials to declare their assets, a rather reasonable request, one would have to say.
Well, I'll let Eric comment on that.
I think it's a trick to get into a specific case. I've never met Xu Zhiyong. I haven't read his case report. You could put up a propaganda case. Xu Zhiyong. I don't know enough. I think he broke the law. There is a anti-subversion law that you cannot organize. Let me come back to another interesting concept I'd like to touch on about liberty again. This is an idea I really like, freedom. And of course, Isaiah Berlin said that there are 2 kinds of freedoms: negative freedom and positive freedom. And negative liberty is the freedom from something, that I could do what I want, don't interfere. Positive freedom is freedom to do something, to effect, to organize a political party, to give speech, to publish, okay? And I would argue that most people care about negative freedom. Those few who are really passionate about reforming society and making society in their own, in the idealist utopia, they want positive freedom. They want the freedom to form political parties and do these things. So I think, yes, in China, positive freedom is greatly curtailed. But negative freedom, the freedom to do what you want while you're not in the public square, but in your own space, I think it's greater than the United States. Let me give you a few examples. In America, you cannot even open a restaurant without building a ramp for wheelchairs. ADA. It's an enormous invasion of negative freedom. Okay, so I would argue, to some extent, in some respect, I mean, I'm not making a total case here, in some respect, you could argue that in China, actually, negative freedom, the range of negative freedom the individual could enjoy is wider than many Western democracies. Now, in positive freedom, it's much, much more strict, much, much narrower.
Let me come back on a couple specifics. First of all, I suspect you and I are both members of the same men's club in San Francisco.
Yes.
And but the Tea Party, for example, being denied the right to organize itself at the local level, et cetera, because of Internal Revenue Service regulations in the United States. Some of these restrictions of political organization that bother me probably wouldn't bother you, but at the same time, I did support the Supreme Court's decision in terms of removing restrictions on how much people can give, because right now, if you want to write for Huffington Post and I want to write for the Heritage Foundation Foundry, we have our own outlets.
Right.
We aren't being constrained on one side by Charles and David Koch, or on another side by liberals from buying up all the TV commercials.
Right.
So, you know, some of your allegations, I guess, are just a little bit over the top when you're criticizing where we are and where we're trying to go. I don't make the case that democracy in the United States is perfect, but I will say that there's a great deal more participation in both negative and positive freedom, I think, in the United States than there is in the PRC.
I mean, I told you I would come off as a moderate on this panel. In terms of this negative and positive liberty, I mean, I think that to preserve the meritocratic aspect, we need to come clean and say that there needs to be limits on the freedom of association to form political parties. But beyond that, I think China, as you know, has become much more complex and with different interest groups and so on. And there's going to be a need for, I think, much more openness in terms of freedom of association and freedom to form NGOs. I mean, it's moving in that direction, but I think it's bound to become more open in that respect. But we need to come clean and say, except for the freedom to form political parties. But the rest, I don't think we need to justify, I mean, at least that's my view. So in other words, I think there's a good case to be made for a more open society as China develops, but, and maybe this is where the founding fathers, including John Stuart Mill, who was against political parties, but they didn't make it so explicit that if you're against political parties, you need to just, enshrine it in the Constitution, this limit on forming political parties and make the penalties clear, and I think that would be a much, much better way of proceeding than a kind of somewhat arbitrary way of drawing the lines and, and imprisoning people for this or that. We don't really know how things are decided, and it seems kind of arbitrary.
In fact, in France and Germany, a lot of the European democracies, they did outlaw political parties for a very, very long time.
If I could just come back on one of your points, Eric, the point about big government in America, stifling companies, stifling innovation, all the sort of the red tape. It so happens that I spent an hour with Premier Li Keqiang last week. And he spent much of that time talking about his mission, which was to dismantle approval systems and structures in China to allow businesses to flourish. And his main argument, or one of his main arguments, was that the approval system that you have in place now encourages corruption and rent-seeking behavior. And indeed, that's one of the big planks of the Communist Party and of the reforms that are being spearheaded by President Xi Jinping. On the issue of corruption, you say there's corruption as bad as hell in all sorts of places around the world. Isn't this now one of the defining characteristics of the Chinese political system?
Corruption is a big problem for Chinese system at the moment, and I think I think it traces back in history for a very, very long time. It has unique historical and cultural roots, and there's probably no easy solution to it. You could try to contain it, but you can never eliminate it, I don't think. But I do want to make one point that I think to link corruption, the level of corruption, to the nature of the political system, I think it's just a really weak case.
But you did that earlier in your...
Yeah, I gave that. I mean, if you look at all the data, Transparency International, for instance, that's the one I used. I don't actually buy the data, but that's the data everybody accepts, so I use it, okay? China is ranked, 70-something, okay? It's been moving up. It's moving up from 80-something to 70-something. India, the greatest democracy, is 95 and dropping, okay? Italy is at 68 or something. China is now tied with Greece, which is electoral democracy. And in fact, if you look at all the countries that are ranked below China, the 100 countries also that are ranked below China, more than half of them are electoral democracies. So if elections didn't fix corruption for those countries, what is there a case that? So I don't think level of corruption is inherently linked to the political system. Number one. Number two, in fact, after the Cold War, corruption came to the forefront as a global governance issue. So a lot of people saying corruption is a problem, corruption is a problem. So all these global organizations, UN, whatever, World Bank, issue those handbooks about how to fix corruption. And the panacea is all the same. Have elections, have parties, have free press, independent judiciary, okay? And then all these countries adopted them. And one example I like to use, because somebody did make a big study, Professor McIntyre of National University of Australia studied Indonesia. So in the case of Indonesia, Suharto, you have Suharto, horribly corrupt, okay? And then you got rid of Suharto. They did everything those handbooks told them to do. Multi-party elections, lots of parties, elections, independent judges, independent press. And then in Professor McIntyre's word, Indonesia went from one Suharto to thousands of little Suhartos. And corruption got worse by all data counts. All data counts. Not a single study will show you today Indonesia's corruption is better than Suharto's time. Not one. Okay? So, and they made an independent judiciary. And then guess what happened? All the judges got corrupt. And there's nobody to check them because they're independent. Okay? So it's really I think we ought to be a little more critical, use our own brain a little bit, instead of just read, the New York Times or something, or CNN, whatever they tell you. I mean, you got to think a little bit more, and look at the data a little bit more closely. I'm not making a case here. I'm analyzing. And if you can show me data and show me facts that point to a different direction, I'll switch. I mean, I'm a student here. I'm not a politician. So.
You may have a point when it comes to the New York Times. I'm just kidding. We have 15 minutes left. So let's throw it open to the floor. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Lei Eric Lee, Ewha University and the Asan Institute. Dr. Lee, you're always productively provocative, but someone has to call you out on your Taiwan democracy remarks. I mean, I don't think the problems that you identify in Taiwan society are the result of Taiwan's democracy, however imperfect. It has much more to do with Taiwan losing its comparative advantage vis-a-vis a rising China and the pressure that a rising China puts Taiwan's democracy under. And someone's got to call you out on that. To Dr. Fulner, I wonder if you could say some words about democracy promotion, and particularly on cyber, because the first point you mentioned about individual space can be increased by the internet, but by internet controls, that individual space may be actually becoming less and less over time. And to Professor Bell, always fascinating. But when you talk about meritocracy, are you selecting on the dependent variable? By studying China at a period in history, after 30 years of the most impressive economic development in human history, are you not attributing some of China's success to some particular things in China's system which may not have external validity outside of China? Thank you very much.
Dr. Fuller, would you like to respond?
You're absolutely right in terms of transparency, the internet accessibility. Erdogan, again, going back to the Turkish case with the local elections a month ago, 3 days before the election, banned access to Facebook, Twitter, etc. Yes, I mean, it can be denied, but at the same time, the fact that it is out there and that there is accessibility to it by large numbers of people in democratic and in non-democratic systems is, to me, a great advance from when I was first involved in the political arena 45, 50 years ago. And viva more diverse views on all these different subjects, however they arise. I come back from the era, looking around, I don't see anybody else with more gray hair or less hair than I have, but when the Shah of Iran basically came down because of the technology of that era, which was cassette tapes being smuggled back into Iran, primarily from Paris and other European capitals, talking about what a different system would be like in Iran. So it's very exciting for me to be a proponent of more transparency and of more democratic systems in this era when there are so many more ways that it can reach out to real people.
Well, on this question of China and political meritocracy, and let me just frame it in this way. I mean, how distinctive is it to China? And here, I mean, I think the political culture matters, you know, that China has a long history of political meritocracy. I mean, in some sense, the last 30 years is a kind of, you know, re-establishment of the kind of imperial system where leaders were chosen by means of examinations and then performance at lower levels of government. I mean, in some sense, it's kind of drawing on that history. And there's a long history of debates among political thinkers in China about what we can call political meritocracy. What are the rights abilities that matter for leaders? What are the right virtues? How can we measure them? And how can we institutionalize a system that chooses leaders with those superior virtues? So the whole idea of political meritocracy, it resonates in China because of this prior political culture. But in a different context, I wouldn't be so keen actually on criticizing democracy. And maybe here I'm a bit different than Eric. I mean, I think if the alternative to one person, one vote is military dictatorship or authoritarian populism, I mean, I'd be cheering for one person, one vote. And if a country doesn't have a long history of political meritocracy, I'd be very careful about criticizing democracy. I mean, in the case of Egypt, I actually think, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood was bad, but not that bad, much better than what happened since they were overthrown. I mean, I would actually, you know, support democracy in that context because it doesn't have a long history of political meritocracy, and the alternative to democracy is much worse. But in the case of China, there is this history of political culture. There is this political culture that of meritocracy. And it makes sense to try and reestablish it in a way which is more suitable to modern conditions. So I don't think it's just the last 30 years that explains why political meritocracy has been relatively, you know, successful, notwithstanding the tons of flaws in China.
More questions from the floor? Stunned into silence. Eric, yeah.
Let me sort of quickly respond to your point. I want to clarify something. I certainly did not mean to state or prove a causal relation between democracy and Taiwan's troubles. Okay, I'm merely, I mean, that's impossible to prove anyways. So somebody needs to really conduct a study. I haven't. I'm merely stating a correlational fact that they've had these elections and Taiwan has a lot of these troubles. Now, I take your point. A lot of people have left Taiwan and went to mainland because of economic opportunities. But also, there are a large number of Taiwanese who have left the island because they thought that the political environment is so poisoned, in their view. Lots, in droves. I don't know, I'm not saying they're in the majority, but yes, also there are many, many who moved to the mainland because of the economic opportunities. But, I mean, I guess that, that's sort of my point. I mean, democracy is not even attractive enough to keep their own people from moving to a tyrannical system or authoritarian regime for money. I mean, how strong of a system is that?
Okay. I have to tell you, the openness of Taiwan society, indeed the ability of Taiwan people to go and live and work in China and trade with China is a function of the democracy that we had, we've seen evolving there over the last 20 years or so. But put that over. Do we have any other questions from the floor?
So I think one thing that we may bring into the conversation is the original concept of republicanism. Not the Republican Party, but per se, not that I have anything against it, but that it is partly a meritocracy in the sense that it's incredible focus on the excellence of a citizen, what it takes, the virtue of a citizen, that takes precedent. And in fact, the idea that the only way you actually prove worthiness of becoming a true citizen, worthy of engaging in public discourse, is that you have your own economic means to support yourself, so that you don't then turn the political public arena into where you seek economic opportunity for yourself, which is then the corruption of the two realm. So, that used to be the original, in a sense, that's almost a meritocratic system in a sense. And if you look at at least the original Athenian system of it was all about the liberal arts and stuff that we now learn as the epitome of what it means to be an intellectual these days. So in a sense, it's a combination of meritocracy based upon this conception of human excellence, which is based upon what we now call intellectual excellence. Now, I think that used to be what we used to, it's a combination of the original conception of democracy and the original conception of republicanism. That is something that is very, very different now in terms of the democracy that is practiced. The only thing that I could sort of detect that's left of that is the Senate in the US, in the sense that it's the millionaires club. People don't have to worry about their economic well-being, the people who come to the Senate, right? So they are supposed to be then completely free of concerns about their own economic well-being to engage in the truly public thing. The only problem there then is that they come there with freedom from economic want, but then do they have the intellectual content necessary to really fully engage in what is really good for the public realm? I think the problem these days when we talk about democracy is that none of the democracies that we're talking about is in any of these pure forms. That's why some people, when we talk about reforming the democratic system, are really talking about the original form of republicanism, right? Which is maybe the French system. I don't know. There are different versions of it. But I think in whatever system we're looking for, there has to be an element of meritocracy. There has to be an element of freedom from economic want, and there has to be an element of something that has to do with people who are then free from economic want to be engaged in something that is called a public sphere, right? You can't just be escape into private interest. I mean, I think that's the fundamental contradiction from the original republicanism with liberal individualism, right? Those two are, it's another contradiction, actually, if you look at it. Escape into privacy is something that the original Athenians thought was really the worst form of behavior, because if you have the means, then you're supposed to be engaged in the public realm. I think that's the sense, that's the kind of spirit that we're all searching for, and I think the idea is that whichever country that has been able to preserve that the best and somehow connect that to the political elite is the one that's the best system. And I think that's the sense in which I think, for instance, the American university system still, it's not just, you know, creativity and MIT and technological superiority, but I think the kind of discourses that they engage in, liberal education that they engage, the British system too, in talking about the importance of the public realm that they constantly drum into you. I mean, that's something that I think is really important, and that's what I think is really interesting about the Chinese tradition or the Confucian tradition, because it's also the same in the sense that it's that sense of the public, or if you're the elite, you're supposed to be serving the public interest, regardless of your private interest. That is being drummed into you. And it's a matter of each system finding a way to produce elites that will completely devote themselves to that public realm while providing them with the sufficient economic base, right? And that's the hardest trick for any country to do. And that's the part that I think we're now every country is beginning to face some very serious troubles with, right? So I don't know if any system, right, at this particular juncture has that yet. But if that were to be the model, I would like to ask, you know, so Eric, do you think China is the one that really does come closest to producing that public-spirited servant that will really serve the public interest the best for the foreseeable future? Do you think China has the system that is able to reproduce it? Ed, do you think the United States really actually has that system, given all the money politics that it's becoming quote unquote corrupted with? Daniel, in the middle, you choose. Okay, also.
But I think China's system's evolving, so it's hard to say whether they're producing virtuous or whether they're structurally producing virtuous leaders. At the very least, they're producing capable ones. The website won't go down. I think that's very. I think it's on a reasonably good trajectory. I think overall. I mean, because the official selection process is highly competitive, so you really got to deliver. It's very difficult to takes 30 years to move all the way to the top. Of course, there are a few bad apples, and then there are corrupt ones. But when you do get it to the top, you are at least competent. And they need to work on corruption to make sure that's cleaned up to a reasonable extent. Then I think it will be a reasonable system in terms of meritocratic selection.
In the United States, I appreciate the subtlety of your argument, particularly, Chae-Bong, that it's fine for me to pull out a copy of the Constitution and revert to that. The fact is, we have come a long way away from the ideal, and citing John Stuart Mill versus where we actually are, whether it's in China or whether it's in the United States, is a very different situation that we find ourselves in. One of my primary concerns is not so much money in politics, it's vested interests more broadly understood that result in a government ratchet. Every time a new program comes into existence, no matter how many independent think tanks or government agencies come along and can describe the fact that X billion dollars is being spent on 17 different pre-kindergarten education experiments, all to no avail, because by the time the children are in third grade, the advantages that they had have all disappeared because it all goes back to intact family. There's no way you're going to get rid of those because they all have their built-in constituents in terms of the internal political structure. So in that way, I guess the notion of finding an elite somewhere who can come along and change those kinds of things is, I guess, superficially appealing. But gosh, I hope that in our system, at least in the United States, we can come up with people with the political courage and the knowledge to look objectively and say, hey, this is a better way to do it, this one's not as good, and how do we then take care of all the citizens at different levels? Not perfect, but we don't live in a perfect world, I guess.
I mean, I agree with my friend Chebong that whether it's a democracy or a Chinese type, democratic meritocracy system, the task is how to select political elites. No matter what kind of society, any large modern society is going to have elites, and the question is how could we select ones which have ability and virtue. I mean, in the Chinese case, I agree with Eric that ability is less of a problem than virtue. Virtue here meaning that the leaders are committed to the common good, not so much to their own private interests. But I think there's ways to change it without challenging the whole system. For example, one problem now in the selection process is that too much depends on the views of superiors, and it's very easy for superiors to have biased views of the moral character of the people they're selecting. There's lots of social science studies that show that peers have a much better idea of the moral character of people. So I think if the selection process could place more emphasis on peer selection rather than depending so much on superiors, it would be a huge improvement in terms of improving the virtue of the political leaders in China. Again, in a democracy, once you have one person, one vote, you can't change it because people just become, attached to it regardless of the arguments for and against it. There's deep psychological reasons. In Taiwan too, I mean, I've been to Taiwan also many times, and people are aware of the flaws of the system, but nobody in Taiwan hardly argues for replacing one person, one vote. It's something deeply psychological that once you're in a voting booth and you have this sense of empowerment, I can choose my leaders, you just can't change it. No matter how bad the system is. So we have to build on that system in a place that already implements it. And in the case of the U.S., I think the founding fathers, I agree that we're much more concerned with merit, or they were at least as much concerned with merit as with democratic consent. But many of the meritocratic aspects of the political system have been downgraded over the years, and the whole language of merit is no longer appropriate. There's a good book called Merit. I don't know if you saw it, and he argues it's a professor of history at Cornell. I don't remember his name. That the whole language of merit, is no longer there, but it used to be so prominent in the U.S. Again, there's this tendency towards populism and one person, one vote once things are implemented, and I think it's more of a challenge in a democratic system to think of ways of selecting leaders with ability and virtue than it is perhaps in a Chinese-style political system. But I think there are ways. I mean, Nicholas Reagan, he has this think tank which in California, they're doing very fascinating projects for injecting more meritocracy in the system, especially in California where there's these huge excesses of populism. And you can do that in some ways without challenging one person, one vote.
Thank you. We're out of time, I'm afraid. This promised to be a lively panel. You didn't disappoint. Thanks for being a great panel and a great audience. Thank you.
大家好，欢迎来到烽火的频道。本期视频分享的是2014年5月8日，由《华尔街日报》的安德鲁·布朗主持，李世默、丹尼尔·艾德温等人参加的一档辩论节目。这个节目最让人觉得有意思的地方是李世默将民主的定义给彻底的划开，大家敞开来辩。李世默将民主的定义一一列举，一人一票、多党竞选执政、全民公投等，并直指这样的制度如今面临着严重的危机，体制僵化、政党内斗，只考虑个人利益，自由和平等并不能共存等问题，让西方灯塔彻底的破防，非常值得一看。其实李世默的这段对话也引发了很大的争议他将一个地缘政治的热点台湾的经济困境作为一个切入点，作为一个炮弹，彻底引爆了对西方民主体制核心的质疑。李世默用大量的例子把台湾民主批的是一文不值他表示台湾的衰退 不是两岸竞争的偶然结果，而是民主制度本身的内在的缺陷被放大后的一个必然的结局。当然最吸引人的观点呢，是他对自由和民主这对民主基石提出质疑。他提出的有钱人可以买断广告时段，穷人请不起律师这样的例子精准地命中了西方资本主义民主最脆弱的痛点，就是形式上的是权力平等，终究无法对抗实质上的财富不公。李世默表示当代民主的危机并非源于某位政客的失败，而是源于其底层逻辑的崩塌。在一个财富高度集中的时代，自由成了有钱人的特权，平等成了无法实现的口号。当这两个概念相互的攻击无法调和时制度便陷入了永久的内耗，无法自我修正，最终走向后民主的未来。大家可能认为李世默说的这些都是在为中国的模式做辩护，其实不是。他不是在批评民主的执行问题他是在质疑民主的存续问题。一种不能选贤任能，不能自我纠错，不能解决自身哲学矛盾的体制，无论其口号是多么的动听，都无法适应新时代的竞争。不信大家就等着看。好了，本期的视频就分享到这里，我们下期再见。